The Krorks were a species whose existence remains half buried beneath the weight of myth, fragmented record, and the slow erosion of time. To study them is to peer into the darkened margins of the galaxy's earliest eras, when the stars themselves were battlegrounds for powers now remembered only in echoes. They were created during the period known in Imperial records as the War in Heaven, a conflict fought across millions of star systems between the Old Ones and the C'tan, with countless other emergent races drawn into the cataclysm. It was during this age of near-total devastation that the Krorks came into being, not as a naturally evolved species, but as a deliberately designed war race. Their creators, most often identified in fragments as the Old Ones, engineered them for one purpose: to fight and to survive wars of a scale far beyond ordinary comprehension. Unlike other species of the time, who relied on conventional biology or technological augmentation, the Krorks were bioengineered from their inception to endure environments, weapons, and enemies that could extinguish entire civilizations in a single engagement. The records that survive suggest that their creation was not impulsive, but instead represented the culmination of Old One mastery in genetics, psychoactive biology, and adaptive evolution. The Krorks were meant to be a final answer to the threats posed by the C'tan and their Necron legions, creatures who could consume the life force of stars and transform matter into weaponized energy. Against such foes, a conventional army was insufficient. Only a force bred for infinite endurance, overwhelming aggression, and near-limitless regenerative potential could stand in the path of such annihilation. The Krorks' origins therefore occupy a unique space in galactic prehistory. They were not gods, nor machines, nor merely soldiers. They were a living weapon race. Their purpose was neither to build empires nor to tend civilizations, but to hunt and kill generation after generation across wars that spanned epochs. The Old Ones shaped them with foresight. They would grow stronger in the presence of violence, they would pass their durability to each new generation, and they would expand endlessly into whatever voids they were placed. If one were to draw parallels with later human constructs, one might think of the Space Marines of the Emperor, but magnified far beyond that scale and stripped of all higher cultural purpose. The Krorks were not defenders of ideals or banners, they were engines of attrition. Physiologically, the Krorks dwarfed most species of their age. Surviving descriptions suggest that they stood far taller than the modern Orks, who are believed to descend from them, with reports ranging from 10 meters to even larger in extreme cases. Their bodies were layered with dense muscle fibers interlaced with bioengineered toughness that rendered them resistant to weapons that would have annihilated baseline humanoid life. Their bones were not fragile calcium structures, but hardened frameworks capable of withstanding both concussive and thermal extremes. Accounts emphasize their sheer size, often describing them as towering shapes capable of crushing battle constructs with their fists, tearing through enemies not with delicate weaponry but with the brutal efficiency of their own strength. Weight estimates vary, but given their mass and scale, it is believed that a single Krork could weigh several tons. Yet despite this enormity, they were not slow. Their musculature and energy conversion systems allowed them to move with speed and ferocity, covering battlefield distances in moments and striking with blows capable of crushing armoured enemies outright. Their resilience was not limited to external durability. Internal systems were layered redundantly, with circulatory and respiratory backups woven into their biology. A Krork could survive wounds that would instantly kill other beings, and in many cases continue fighting long after such damage should have incapacitated them. Most extraordinary, however, was their regenerative capacity. They did not simply heal in the way most biological life does. Their flesh knitted itself with remarkable speed, rebuilding torn muscle and sealing wounds even amidst battle. This was not a mere evolutionary quirk, it was deliberate design. The Old Ones required a species that could sustain continuous conflict without relying on long rest periods or vulnerable supply networks. Each Krork therefore carried within itself the ability to endure almost endless punishment. Entire limbs could be lost and regrown. Severe trauma that would require years of recovery in other species was repaired within days or even hours. This regenerative trait extended into their reproductive capacity as well, ensuring that their numbers could replenish as fast as, or faster than, they were destroyed. The Krorks' biology was not solely physical. The Old Ones understood that their war needed more than raw strength. Against the psychic forces unleashed by both the Catan and their own manipulations of the Immaterium, the Krorks required formidable resistance. Their minds were therefore saturated with dampening fields of psychic nullification. While not true blanks in the sense later known to the Imperium, they carried within them a kind of stabilizing psychic resonance. The warp could not easily fracture them. Madness, corruption, and possession, which so easily afflicted other warborn creations, found little purchase in their minds. At the same time, their latent psychic potential manifested in practical, instinctive ways. They did not wield sorcery or complex psychic techniques, but their shared gestalt field allowed them to coordinate, endure, and empower their war machines. This field, carried subconsciously within their species, echoed in later ages as the phenomenon now associated with the Orks' strange reality-altering presence. Recruitment in the human sense was irrelevant. The Krorks were not gathered from volunteers or conscripts. They were seeded, unleashed, and left to multiply. Each Krork was born already prepared for war, carrying within its genetic code the instincts and abilities needed for battle. They did not need academies or years of training. They fought because it was intrinsic to their being, not because they were taught. The Old Ones did not create an army that required maintenance of morale or motivation. They created a predator race whose entire mode of existence was war. Tactically, the Krorks were overwhelming forces of direct assault. They did not maneuver delicately or deploy subtle stratagems. Their doctrine was to engage, to close, and to destroy. This does not imply mindless savagery. Their war instincts included coordination, flanking, and the intuitive use of terrain. But their central advantage was that their enemies could never outlast them. The Krorks absorbed casualties with indifference, as their regenerative abilities and reproductive cycles ensured constant replenishment. Where the Necrons could rise again through reanimation protocols, the Krorks responded with equal relentlessness, rising through natural recovery and endless reinforcements. Their battles were therefore wars of attrition, stretching across star systems and even galactic sectors. A Krork offensive was not a single campaign, but a sustained storm of violence, often continuing long after other allied forces had collapsed or withdrawn. It is believed that the Old Ones unleashed them across multiple fronts, scattering them as bulwarks against advancing Necron phalanxes and Catan incursions. Each Krork force became a wall of flesh and iron, advancing until they were destroyed or until the enemy was simply overwhelmed. In many cases, their presence alone could halt an enemy offensive by absorbing its momentum. Culturally, little is directly preserved of the Krorks. They were not a species designed for civilization, and their legacy is seen only in the echoes carried forward into the Orks. It is theorized that their society, if it can be called such, revolved entirely around combat hierarchies. Leadership was determined by strength, cunning, and the ability to dominate others. Social bonds were not based on kinship or mutual support, but on a constant cycle of conflict, testing, and demonstration of power. This internal structure ensured that even without external enemies, the Krorks would remain honed for war. They did not decay in peace because they never allowed themselves peace. Their technology, although guided by the Old Ones' templates, was shaped by their psychic gestalt field. Weapons and war machines created for them often functioned not through precise engineering alone, but through their collective presence. Machines that should not have worked in conventional terms did so when enough Krorks believed in them, an echo of the same principle seen later in Ork culture. This allowed them to field an arsenal that was both crude and devastating, simple in design but devastating in effect, because their will and gestalt reinforced its operation. The Old Ones, in their desperation, had built not only soldiers but living conduits of psychic-enabled warfare. What is striking is that despite their scale and power, the Krorks were never remembered as rulers or builders. Their cities, if they had any, have long since vanished. Their monuments were not structures but battlefields scarred into planets and star systems. The Krorks existed as war made flesh, and once their creators fell and the war in heaven drew to its catastrophic conclusion, they began to degenerate. Without the structure imposed by the Old Ones and without enemies of equivalent magnitude, their form and purpose shifted. They diminished over eons into what the galaxy now recognizes as Orks, still warlike, still innumerable, still empowered by their psychic field, but no longer the towering titans they once were. Yet in their origins, the Krorks represented perhaps the most complete vision of a biological weapon ever realized. They were bred to fight gods and machines that consumed stars. They carried within themselves the capacity to wage endless war without supply lines, without morale collapse, and without fear of psychic corruption. In their time, they were among the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever produced, and their battles remain among the most destructive campaigns recorded in the shadowed histories of the war in heaven. The technological style of the Krorks was inseparable from their biology and their psychic resonance. Unlike the carefully engineered constructs of the Necrons or the precision machinery of the Old Ones, Krork technology was a hybrid of deliberate design and instinctive functionality. It was simultaneously crude in appearance and devastating in execution. What made it unique was that it was not required to conform to the laws of conventional mechanics in order to function. The Gestalt psychic field generated by the Krorks themselves acted as a stabilizing and enabling force. Where another species might find a war engine unworkable or dangerously unstable, a Krork warband could operate it with unerring effectiveness. This relationship between user and machine meant that their weapons and tools were not delicate or refined. They were massive, brutal implements that reflected the physical scale of their wielders. Firearms, when used, were not precision rifles but colossal cannons capable of obliterating armoured constructs in a single burst. Blades were often as tall as smaller species, fashioned from slabs of metal that the Krorks could swing with terrifying speed. Energy weapons existed among them as well, though again these did not resemble the clean lines of Necron Gauss weaponry or the sleek architecture of Old One tools. Instead, they often appeared ramshackle, covered in protrusions, and yet when brought to bear they delivered arcs of destructive power capable of stripping enemy armour or vaporizing infantry in swathes. Vehicles followed the same principle. Krork transports, tanks and aircraft were vast, heavy and seemingly rough-hewn. Surviving depictions suggest that these machines looked as though they should collapse under their own weight, or fail to ignite under normal principles of engineering. But under the control of the Krorks, they performed with terrifying consistency. A Krork battle tank could withstand fire that would annihilate the armoured units of other species, and its weaponry delivered devastating blows. Airborne craft, though bulky and unstable by visual assessment, flew with uncanny precision, supported by the psychic resonance of their operators and passengers. The Old Ones, in creating the Krorks, ensured that they were both self-replicating organisms and self-replicating military forces, for their Gestalt field permitted them to build and operate weapons far beyond their intellectual design capacities. The vehicles fielded by the Krorks were not limited to small-scale war machines. They are recorded as having deployed constructs of truly colossal size, walking engines and armoured fortresses that rivaled the greatest creations of the war in heaven. These titanic war engines served as mobile command centres and siege weapons, capable of crushing armies underfoot or bombarding planetary fortifications into ruin. In later eras, echoes of these machines would be seen in the gargants employed by the Orks, though in diminished form. Where the Ork gargants often appear barely functional, the Krork equivalents were efficient instruments of destruction, their effectiveness guaranteed not by careful construction, but by the sheer psychic presence of the Krorks themselves. The tools of the Krorks extended beyond weapons and vehicles. Their engineering capacity, such as it was, revolved entirely around the replication of war equipment. Civilian technologies in the conventional sense did not exist. There were no devices designed for comfort, luxury, or even agriculture. Every tool served war directly or indirectly. Manufacturing, if it can be called such, was less a process of planned industry and more an instinctive act. The Krorks built because they felt the need to build, hammering metal into forms that to outside observers seemed chaotic, but which to them were self-evident. Their technology was thus an expression of will as much as material design. The social structure of the Krorks reflected this same martial orientation. Their hierarchy was simple, brutal and effective. Leadership was determined by strength, cunning, and the ability to dominate others in combat. At the highest levels of command stood warlords of immense size and power, individuals whose authority derived not from election, heredity, or ideology, but from their capacity to defeat all challengers. These warlords were not kings or emperors in the human sense. They did not administer nations or oversee economies. They were focal points of violence around which other Krorks gathered. The larger and more destructive a warlord became, the more followers he attracted, until his warband could number in the millions. Beneath the warlords existed layers of sub-commanders and champions, each maintaining authority over smaller groups by the same principle of personal dominance. There was no codified law or written doctrine to regulate this hierarchy. It was sustained entirely by the reality of violence. To disobey a warlord was to invite immediate challenge and destruction. This ensured a form of stability, not through consensus or compromise, but through the constant demonstration of power. The Krorks therefore never suffered from internal fragmentation in the same way as more politically complex societies. When disputes arose, they were resolved by combat. The victor became the leader, and the matter was settled. Values, if such a word can be applied to them, revolved entirely around strength, war, and survival. The Krorks did not pursue philosophy or art. They did not engage in trade or diplomacy. Their entire cultural framework was oriented toward the perpetuation of conflict. This was not seen as destructive from their perspective, for it was simply their nature. To be strong was to be respected, to be weak was to be crushed, and to fight was the only true purpose. They had no conception of peace, no aspiration toward harmony, and no desire for anything beyond the battlefield. Even when not engaged in external war, they fought among themselves. These internal conflicts were not signs of instability but of cultural continuity. Fighting was the medium through which they expressed themselves, maintained their skills, and established order. Civilian roles, in the sense familiar to the Imperium, were nearly non-existent. The Krorks did not require farmers, artisans, or administrators. Their biology allowed them to survive in hostile environments without complex support systems. Their reproductive cycles ensured population growth without structured familial systems. Their technology was instinctive, meaning that construction and maintenance of weapons did not require dedicated labour classes. As such, what would be classified as civilians in other societies were simply lesser warriors within Krork culture. Every Krork was a fighter, and even those who built machines or tended to wounded comrades were doing so in direct service to war. The line between soldier and civilian did not exist for them. Military roles, by contrast, were all-encompassing. Every Krork was both a soldier and a resource for war. They fought as infantry, operated vehicles and manned starships, all without the distinctions common to other races. There were specialists of a kind, such as those more inclined toward constructing weapons or piloting craft, but these were not considered separate professions. They were simply warriors with particular tendencies, still subject to the same hierarchy of dominance and combat. In this way, the Krorks embodied a society in which war was not only the highest calling, but the only calling. Their lives were war from inception to death, with no divergence into other paths. This orientation had profound consequences for their long-term development. Because they lacked civilian structures, the Krorks did not produce literature, monuments, or traditions outside of battle. Their legacy was written only in destruction. Where they passed, worlds were burned, and where they gathered, battlefields were created. They didn't colonize in the human sense, building cities or establishing infrastructure. Instead, they infested environments, turning them into bases from which to launch further wars. This ensured that their presence could spread endlessly, as they required no supply chains or logistics beyond what they could construct instinctively. The Krork social order was therefore one of perpetual motion. Warlords led armies into conflict, armies fought until they were victorious or destroyed, and survivors regrouped under new leaders to begin again. This cycle was self-sustaining, requiring no external input and no broader purpose. It was simply the expression of what they were created to be. The Old Ones, in designing them, had not sought to create a civilization in the conventional sense. They had sought to create a weaponized ecosystem, one that would sustain itself indefinitely through its own violence. The Krorks, in every aspect of their technology, hierarchy, and culture, reflected this origin. The absence of civilians, coupled with the psychic reinforcement of their tools and machines, meant that the Krorks were uniquely suited for total war. They did not require the support structures that limited other species. Their entire population was effectively a combat-ready force. Their leaders were combatants themselves, not detached strategists. Their technology was self-generating, sustained by instinct and belief. The result was a society that could function indefinitely in a state of permanent war, never requiring peace, never desiring it, and never collapsing under the weight of its own aggression. It is within this framework that the Krorks must be understood. They were not simply another race of warriors. They were the most complete expression of war as a way of life, with no division between civilian and military, no separation between society and battlefield. Every aspect of their existence was subsumed into this purpose, making them uniquely suited to the cataclysmic conflicts of the war in heaven and uniquely incapable of existing outside of such wars. Their degeneration into orcs in later millennia reflects this paradox. Without wars on the same scale as those they were created to fight, they shrank, diminished, and spread into countless lesser forms. Yet even in their degenerate state, the orcs remain one of the most enduring and dangerous species in the galaxy, a testament to the potency of the Krork design. The Krorks existed as a war race engineered to confront the most destructive forces of the galaxy. Within their vast ranks, certain figures and units rose to prominence, remembered in fragmented accounts and later echoes preserved in myth. These champions were not kings, emperors, or lords in the conventional sense. They were warlords whose power and scale distinguished them from their peers, titanic beings whose strength, cunning, and psychic resonance made them forces of devastation on par with entire armies. The Old Ones had not designed the Krorks to rely on singular leaders, yet their culture naturally elevated those of greatest might. Among the most widely referenced figures is the Krork remembered in Ork oral tradition as the Brain Boy, though this name likely represents a distortion through millennia of degeneration. Descriptions of this figure portray a warlord of immense size who combined physical ferocity with a degree of tactical acumen, far exceeding that of his followers. It is believed that such leaders served as focal points not only of command but of psychic coherence. Under their presence, the Krork Gestalt field stabilized to levels capable of supporting vast engines of war, machines that required collective belief and resonance to operate. Such warlords may have been the living linchpins around which entire planetary campaigns turned. The Krorks also fielded champions whose deeds have survived in fragments. There are records of warlords capable of tearing apart Catan shard constructs with their bare hands, individuals so physically immense that even the star-consuming entities of the war in heaven regarded them as worthy of caution. These champions were often surrounded by retinues of lesser warlords, themselves titans in size compared to modern orcs, forming warbands that function like planetary-scale predators. Unlike the structured legions of the Necrons or the carefully balanced hosts of the Old Ones, the Krorks organized themselves around these colossal figures in a natural hierarchy of violence. Famous units among the Krorks were not divisions in the human sense, but rather concentrations of destructive potential. The Krorks fielded immense infantry hordes, each individual a warrior larger than tanks of later ages, advancing in relentless waves. These infantry forces were supported by armoured beasts of war that blurred the line between biology and machinery. Some accounts describe them as living engines, massive organisms augmented with armour plating and weaponry, deployed as frontline shock units. These constructs bore similarities to later orc squigoths and gargantuan beasts, though at a far larger scale, and with greater battlefield coordination. War machines were perhaps the most striking aspect of Krork military might. The most famous of these were the proto-gargants, titanic walking engines of destruction that served as both fortresses and weapons platforms. Unlike the degenerate gargants of the Orks, these Krork constructs were functional war machines, operating with devastating efficiency. They carried energy weapons capable of leveling cities, missile batteries that could shatter orbital defenses, and melee weapons of such scale that they could tear apart enemy titans. These constructs were not merely machines but psychic foci, drawing upon the gestalt field of the Krorks to operate at full capacity. Their presence on the battlefield often turned the tide of campaigns, serving as avatars of destruction that embodied the Krorks' role as living weapons. In addition to these war engines, the Krorks deployed fleets of starships, though these too reflected their peculiar technological style. Their vessels were enormous, crudely constructed by the standards of the old ones, yet terrifyingly effective. Their hulls were vast slabs of metal reinforced by psychic resonance, their engines improbably functional, and their weapon systems devastating in scale. These fleets were not elegant or efficient, but they were virtually unstoppable, capable of overwhelming even the most advanced enemies through sheer mass and destructive output. Where Old One fleets maneuvered with precision, and Necron armadas advanced with surgical coordination, Krork fleets thundered forward like storms, smashing through defences with overwhelming force. The behavioural instincts of the Krorks were as much a part of their design as their physical traits. They were creatures of war, driven by an inborn compulsion to fight. This was not mere aggression or savagery. It was a carefully engineered instinct that ensured they would never falter in their purpose. Their biology compelled them to seek conflict, to test themselves against enemies, and to grow stronger through battle. This instinct was so deeply ingrained that even in the absence of external foes, Krorks turned upon one another, maintaining their war readiness through endless internal struggles. These tendencies ensured that the Krorks were perpetually honed for combat. They could not become complacent or weak, for their very society revolved around fighting. Victory was rewarded with authority, while defeat meant death or submission. This constant cycle of conflict guaranteed that only the strongest and most adaptable survived, creating a natural selection process that refined their species into ever more formidable warriors. In this way, the Krorks embodied the principle of war as life itself, a race for whom combat was not an activity but a state of being. Rituals existed within this framework, though they were far removed from the ceremonial practices of other species. The Krorks did not construct temples or perform elaborate rites. Their rituals were expressions of violence, acts of dominance, and demonstrations of power. To claim leadership, a Krork warlord would challenge rivals in open combat. To celebrate victory, they would engage in further battles among themselves. Even the construction of weapons and machines carried ritual elements, as Krorks imbued their creations with belief through acts of collective labour and violence. In this sense, their rituals were inseparable from their instincts. Every act of war doubled as a reaffirmation of their nature. Ethics among the Krorks were entirely shaped by strength. They had no conception of morality in the human sense. Right and wrong did not exist, only victory and defeat. To kill was not seen as evil, nor to conquer as unjust. These concepts were alien to their psychology. Instead, their code of existence revolved around respect for power. The strong led because they could. The weak followed or perished. Betrayal was irrelevant, for loyalty itself was not a value they recognized. What mattered was whether one could impose dominance and survive. This produced a society without laws or codes, but nonetheless stable, for its simplicity left no ambiguity. Conflict was the only resolution, and conflict was constant. Within this framework, internal castes or divisions did exist, though they were not formally codified. The Krorks naturally sorted themselves into roles based on size, strength, and instinct. At the top were the warlords, titanic figures whose power ensured command. Beneath them were champions and sub-commanders, followed by the general mass of warriors. Among them, Some displayed inclinations toward constructing weapons or vehicles, serving as proto-mech boy equivalents. Others gravitated toward leadership or organization, resembling the later knobcasts of the Orks. There were even Krorks whose latent psychic potential manifested more strongly, functioning as battle shamans who could direct the Gestalt field with greater intensity. These divisions were not rigid but fluid, determined by continual struggle. A warrior who grew in strength could rise, while one who faltered could fall. There was no permanence in their hierarchy beyond what strength and violence secured. This fluidity ensured constant dynamism within their society, preventing stagnation and guaranteeing that every level of their structure remained active in conflict. The result was a culture without permanence, yet one that remained unbroken, for it thrived on its own instability. The Krorks champions, war machines, instincts, rituals, and protocastes together formed a complete expression of their purpose. They were living weapons whose leaders embodied raw dominance, whose armies existed only to fight, whose machines embodied their collective will, and whose culture reinforced their endless war. In every respect, they were the ultimate realization of the Old One's intent, a species that could endure the war in heaven and confront gods, machines, and horrors with unrelenting violence. That they degenerated into Orks in later ages does not diminish this legacy. Instead, it underscores the paradox of their design. Beings created for war so absolute that, even when diminished, they remain among the galaxy's most persistent threats. The Krorks were not merely a species, they were the living embodiment of conflict itself, their champions titans of destruction, their machines embodiments of psychic resonance, their instincts engines of perpetual battle. They existed to fight, and through fighting they defined themselves. This, above all, was their greatest strength and their greatest limitation. The Imperium of Man has preserved many records concerning ancient threats, but few are as inconsistent or contradictory as those regarding the Krorks. Both the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus claim access to evidence that, if taken at face value, would reshape understandings of Ork origins. Yet in practice, both institutions have approached the matter with political caution, selective suppression, and calculated misdirection. Their interests do not align perfectly. Where the Administratum sees the Krorks as a bureaucratic problem, a dangerous knowledge that must be carefully archived, hidden, or redacted, the Mechanicus regards them as a technological and biological enigma that could unlock ancient knowledge of the Old Ones. These differing agendas have ensured that cooperation has always been shallow, while conflicts between their approaches have repeatedly surfaced in scattered reports, secret treaties, and political maneuverings at the highest levels of the Imperium. From the perspective of the Administratum, any historical entity that predates the Imperium on a galactic scale presents a narrative challenge. The Administratum's primary role is the stabilization of Imperial identity and the sanctity of the God Emperor's legacy. To openly acknowledge that the Krorks once dominated the galaxy on a scale even larger than the Great Crusade is to admit that mankind's current supremacy is tenuous, perhaps even accidental. Hence, the official archives on the War in Heaven, the Old Ones, and the Krorks are deliberately obfuscated. Restricted archives, often buried in sealed libraria, refer to the Krorks under codenames such as Xenos, Extinctus, Alpha Designation, or Proto-Orkoid Warlord Strain. Public-facing histories present the Orks as an eternal nuisance, downplaying the suggestion that their current forms are a degraded remnant of something vastly more powerful. This distinction is politically necessary, for it maintains the illusion of progress and inevitability in humanity's dominion. To admit that the Orks are a shadow of a superior past form would undermine centuries of Administratum propaganda. Thus, Administratum scribes tasked with curating this history often lean towards silence, omission, and compartmentalization. Knowledge of the Krorks is acknowledged in the most secretive levels of the Segmentum archives, but it is actively denied or suppressed within broader records. The Adeptus Mechanicus, however, does not share the same ideological mission. For them, the Krorks represent both a biological and technological relic of immense importance. The Mechanicus has long speculated on the Old Ones, whom some sects equate with divine artificers or lost machine gods. The Krorks, created by the Old Ones to serve as their ultimate weapon, are therefore seen by some magi as direct evidence of the Old Ones' mastery over synthetic biology and weaponized evolution. Krork physiology, if even partially reconstructed, might provide insights into genetic engineering on a scale the Mechanicus can barely comprehend. Yet to openly pursue such research risks censure from the Ordo Xenos and intervention by the ecclesiarchy. The machine cult must therefore cloak its ambitions behind the veil of archaeotechnology expeditions. Whenever Mechanicus fleets have unearthed ruins that hint at Krork remnants, official reports usually describe them as Orkoid anomalous strain or unstable pre-Orkoid war engine. Such terminology allows the Mechanicus to conduct study without acknowledging the deeper implications that these are echoes of a superior galaxy-spanning race. This divergence of purpose has repeatedly brought the Administratum and the Mechanicus into quiet conflict. Administratum clerks, when discovering Mechanicus notations on Krork research, have attempted to redact or reclassify the findings, citing the need for political stability. The Mechanicus, for its part, resents the interference of non-technological authorities in what it regards as sacred research. Skirmishes of authority often play out not in open debate but in hidden margins of archives. For example, in Millennia 36, a rediscovered ruin on the edge of the Ghoul Stars contained reliefs and machinery too large for Ork physiology, as it is understood today. Administratum archivists classified the site as Xenos category Orkoid monument. Mechanicus explorators, however, seized samples of genetic residue and tested them against current Orkoid DNA. The results, suggesting an organism of vastly greater size and resilience, were classified under magenta clearance and circulated only among fabricator lords. When Administratum functionaries attempted to access the findings, their requests were denied, citing liturgical jurisdiction. The resulting standoff illustrates the friction between two institutions ostensibly working toward the same imperial security, but driven by competing interests. Despite such conflicts, cooperation between the Administratum and the Mechanicus has occasionally been achieved, though usually only under conditions of dire necessity. The most notable cases emerge when Ork activity in the present day demonstrates inexplicable anomalies that hint at Krork inheritance. Massive Ork war engines, too large and complex to be explained by contemporary Ork cunning alone, have prompted joint investigations. In such scenarios, Administratum scribes focus on narrative control, ensuring that any public record of these machines describes them as random Ork ingenuity, while Mechanicus magi quietly gather data for comparative analysis against their Krork hypotheses. Both institutions agree on one fundamental principle. The Imperium at large must not know the truth. Their cooperation is therefore rooted not in trust, but in shared secrecy. Each side withholds its most sensitive findings, but both accept that uncontrolled dissemination of Krork history could destabilize Imperial authority. Politics complicates matters further. The Administratum holds power through sheer bureaucratic sprawl, while the Mechanicus commands authority through technological monopoly. The Krorks, as a subject of study, touch directly on the strengths and weaknesses of both. Administratum ministers fear that widespread recognition of Krork supremacy would diminish the glory of the Emperor's conquests, perhaps even invite questions about why the Emperor himself did not address the Krork threat during the Great Crusade. The Mechanicus, meanwhile, fears theological backlash. The cult Mechanicus worships the Omnissiah, and introducing the Krorks as living weapons of the Old Ones threatens to displace the machine god from its role as supreme artificer. Some sects, particularly xenophilic magibiologists, have attempted to reconcile this by portraying the Old Ones as aspects of the machine god, their works as divine precedents for human artifice. But more conservative sects regard any suggestion of Krork supremacy as heresy. Hence, Mechanicus politics on the subject are divided. While some seek to expand Krork studies, others actively suppress them, fearing doctrinal corruption. These tensions play out within broader imperial politics as well. The Inquisition, particularly the Ordo Xenos, acts as a third force overseeing both Administratum and Mechanicus dealings with the Krorks. Inquisitors have occasionally sided with the Administratum, insisting on suppression of dangerous knowledge. At other times, Inquisitors sympathetic to Mechanicus' goals have quietly supported xenotech research, arguing that to defeat the Orks, one must first understand their ultimate potential. This triangulation ensures that the politics of Krork studies are never stable. They shift according to personalities, local power struggles, and the degree of immediate threat posed by Ork activity in a given sector. On rare occasions, Administratum and Mechanicus cooperation has extended to covert agreements. Certain Mechanicus Forge worlds have negotiated with Administratum archivists for selective silence. In exchange for keeping findings classified under innocuous categories, Mechanicus Magi have provided logistical support, weapons production, or debt forgiveness to Administratum authorities. These arrangements are rarely documented, but hints of them survive in redacted records and discrepancies between official and unofficial archive tallies. Such backroom agreements illustrate the pragmatism of both institutions. While they may quarrel over jurisdiction, both ultimately understand the importance of mutual survival within the Imperium's delicate balance of power. In summary, the Administratum and Mechanicus interpret the Krorks through different lenses, one of political narrative, the other of technological fascination. Their relationship is defined less by harmony than by a grudging acceptance of necessity. Cooperation occurs only when secrecy requires it, while conflicts arise from attempts to assert primacy over knowledge. At the political level, both institutions tread carefully, for to expose too much truth about the Krorks risks destabilizing the very foundations of imperial identity and Mechanicus theology. Thus, the Krorks remain a subject simultaneously studied, suppressed, and mythologized. They are both a forbidden truth and a contested secret, shaped by the politics of two great institutions that cannot fully trust each other, yet cannot afford to act alone. The historical record concerning the Krorks is fragmentary, scattered across xenos relics, Mechanicus data vaults, and the most restricted Administratum archives. Yet despite the gaps, there exists a clear pattern. Whenever the Krorks entered the field of war, they did so with overwhelming force, utilizing a combination of immense physical power, instinctive battlefield coordination, and war machines that dwarfed anything produced by humanity's most ambitious forge worlds. Unlike modern Orks, whose fighting style is chaotic, improvisational, and dependent on sheer weight of numbers, the Krorks demonstrated a level of martial sophistication that hints at deliberate design by their Old One creators. To understand the Krorks in battle is to glimpse warfare at a scale and intensity almost unimaginable by the standards of the 41st millennium. The earliest confirmed accounts of Krork combat stem from the latter stages of the War in Heaven, when the Old Ones deployed them as a last and desperate countermeasure against the rising power of the Necrons and their Catan masters. Surviving fragments suggest that the Krorks were unleashed in concentrated waves across multiple war fronts, acting as shock troops capable of halting Necron phalanxes that had previously proven unstoppable. In these engagements, the Krorks exhibited behaviours radically different from the disorganised swarms of modern Orks. Instead of brawling independently or fighting in mobs, they advanced in disciplined formations, utilising war engines and vehicles in a coordinated manner. Accounts describe towering constructs moving in lockstep with infantry Krorks, forming combined arms offensives that pushed against Necron lines with brutal efficiency. One of the most widely referenced conflicts is the so-called Siege of the Black Nebula, recorded in Mechanicus archives as an early attempt by the Necrons to establish a permanent fortress in the void. The Krorks, marshalled in numbers beyond estimation, assaulted the structure directly. Accounts from xenos inscriptions suggest that entire Krork battalions hurled themselves into void environments without protection, relying on sheer biological resilience to breach outer bulwarks. Supporting them were vast war engines, some described as walking fortresses that could stride across the hulls of Necron warships. The fighting was apocalyptic, with Necron gorse fire stripping flesh and metal from entire regiments, only for Krork reinforcements to surge in unbroken waves. Ultimately, the Necron bastion was torn apart, but at a cost that even the Krorks could barely sustain. This battle illustrates a fundamental aspect of Krork warfare. They were designed for attritional conflict, capable of absorbing catastrophic losses and still maintaining offensive pressure until the enemy line broke. Another significant engagement frequently cited by xenologists is the War of the Burning Skies, fought on a planetary scale within the halo zone of the galactic core. This conflict, though poorly documented, is referenced in multiple fragmented inscriptions attributed to both Necrontyr remnants and Old One successors. The Krorks in this theatre appear to have operated with a level of aerial dominance unknown among present-day Orks. Reports describe vast swarms of aerial war beasts, bioengineered organisms large enough to blot out the sky, intermixed with mechanical aircraft piloted by Krork crews. The sheer scale of this combined assault destabilized the Necron presence on the planet, forcing them into subterranean retreat. The term burning skies likely originates from the cataclysmic destruction caused by these aerial hosts, as Necron Goss and Krork ordnance ignited the atmosphere in sustained orbital bombardments. The battle demonstrates another aspect of Krork fighting style, their versatility. They were not confined to brute ground assaults, but could dominate across multiple theatres of war simultaneously. The greatest of the recorded Krork campaigns, however, is often cited as the Cataclysm of Gorkogul. This was not a single battle, but rather a series of system-spanning wars fought during the twilight of the War in Heaven. The details are deeply obscured, but what emerges is the image of a conflict so vast that entire star systems were rendered uninhabitable. Krork forces appear to have been concentrated in numbers beyond any Ork weird known today. Their armies were supplied by an industrial infrastructure that was partially self-sustaining. War machines could salvage their own replacements from the wreckage of battlefields, while Krork physiology allowed for reproduction and reinforcement through instinctual processes not reliant on centralized command. This made their offensives difficult, if not impossible, to contain. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of the Necrons, the Krorks thrived on adaptive chaos. They could fragment into multiple war hosts when required, or consolidate into a singular galaxy-spanning front when confronted by existential resistance. This flexibility may have been their greatest strength, and it was what allowed them to challenge even the immortal armies of the C'tan. Details of their fighting style reinforce the notion that the Krorks were engineered for purpose. In close combat, they were utterly devastating. Accounts describe them tearing apart Necron constructs with their bare hands, their musculature so dense that even Goss weaponry required prolonged exposure to disintegrate them. Unlike modern Orks, whose weaponry is often ramshackle, Krork armaments were consistent, large, and terrifyingly effective. They wielded heavy energy projectors, seismic cannons, and melee weapons capable of cleaving through living metal. Their vehicles range from assault transports to towering war engines, each designed for durability and maximum battlefield presence. Unlike the haphazard mech creations of the present, Krork technology showed evidence of deliberate standardization, suggesting that they inherited knowledge directly from the Old Ones. This degree of order is absent in the Orks of the 41st millennium, who have lost the ability to replicate such technologies, except through instinctive, degraded mimicry. Another striking feature of Krork battle tactics is the role of psychic resonance. Though not as overt as the powers of the Eldar, the Krorks carried within them the psychic imprint of the Old One's genetic design. In the crucible of battle, this resonance manifested as instinctive cohesion. Entire Krork regiments would move with uncanny synchronization, as though guided by a shared martial instinct encoded in their biology. This quality meant that even without centralized command structures, their armies operated as if choreographed. The psychic field they projected also appeared to disrupt enemy forces, perhaps destabilizing Necron coordination or interfering with the energies of the C'tan. Such effects are poorly understood, but modern Ork fields may be degraded echoes of this original capacity. If the Krorks were nearly unstoppable in combat, why then did they not succeed in permanently ending the Necron menace? The answer lies in the scale of attrition. The Krorks were ultimately a weapon of desperation, unleashed too late in the war in heaven to reverse the balance entirely. Their strength was overwhelming, but it came with limitations. They required constant conflict to sustain their cohesion. Without battle, their instinctive unity fractured. The Old Ones, who had hoped to channel this destructive power against the Necrons, were unable to maintain the stability of the species as the war dragged on. Krork war hosts fought not only the Necrons but also turned against one another in the absence of external enemies. These internal wars, poorly documented but hinted at in ancient ruins, may have been as destructive as their intended campaigns. The end result was collapse. Without the Old Ones to direct them, the Krorks devolved into infighting, their biology mutating downward into the Orkoid species known today. The record of Krork warfare is therefore double-edged. On the one hand, it demonstrates the peak of Old One bioengineering, a martial force that shook even the greatest powers of the galaxy. On the other, it illustrates the inherent flaw in designing a species whose only purpose was war. The Krorks could win battles of apocalyptic scale, but they could not maintain a stable civilization. They were capable of burning worlds, but not of holding them. The cycle of endless combat, which defines modern Orks in their devolved state, was already present in the Krorks, though tempered by greater intelligence and more reliable technology. When external enemies ceased to provide adequate outlet, that same instinct turned inward. Thus, the Krorks destroyed themselves as thoroughly as they destroyed their foes. Yet even in their downfall, their battles have left echoes. Ruins across the galaxy bear scars of Krork war engines, some so massive that Mechanicus adepts can scarcely comprehend how they were constructed. Planets rendered lifeless by seismic bombardments, orbital debris fields littered with unidentifiable war machines, and subterranean tombs scarred by melee weapon strikes all testify to their presence. In these traces, the legacy of the Krork survives, not only as myth, but as physical evidence of wars so vast that the modern Imperium can only struggle to imagine their scale. The record of Krork campaigns, though fragmentary, extends beyond isolated references and enters the realm of observable consequences. Where the Krorks fought, they left scars so deep upon the fabric of the galaxy that even the most rigorous administratum surveyors and Mechanicus cartographers are able to discern patterns of destruction. What sets these wars apart from those of other ancient xenos powers is not simply the scale of violence, but the nature of the aftermath. Unlike the Necrons, who left silent tomb worlds, or the Eldar, whose ruins hint at once flourishing societies, the Krorks left behind landscapes of total ruin. War zones permanently altered, resource bases annihilated, and ecosystems collapsed beyond recovery. These were not civilizations, they were battlefields stretched across time and space, and in that respect the Krorks were unique among the species born of the war in heaven. One of the most frequently cited examples of battlefield aftermath comes from the Goroth Expanse, a region containing multiple dead worlds whose geological layers reveal synchronized destruction. Archaeotechnical surveys conducted in Millennia 36 uncovered crustal damage consistent with seismic weaponry, yet distributed across several planets in nearly identical patterns. This consistency suggested a single military doctrine executed across multiple theatres, something the Mechanicus attributed to Krork campaigns. Entire planetary plates had been destabilized, continents fractured into archipelagos, and oceans boiled away. Administratum records highlight the economic impossibility of recovery in such regions. Even in the 41st millennium, none of these worlds have been successfully recolonized. The Krorks' use of seismic and planetary scale weaponry demonstrates not only their destructive capacity, but also their indifference to resource conservation. Unlike the Necrons who sought to harvest, or the Eldar who cultivated, the Krorks obliterated without consideration for aftermath. Another notable theatre is the Draxian Cataclysm, an engagement pieced together from conflicting accounts in surviving Old One inscriptions. The battlefield stretched across an entire system, where Necron tomb fleets attempted to entrench themselves in orbit, around a resource-rich gas giant. The Krorks responded with war engines of such size that even Mechanicus adepts hesitate to classify them as mere machines. Fragments of armor plating discovered in orbit suggest constructs hundreds of kilometers in diameter, possibly rivaling modern Imperial Star fortresses, though of entirely different design. The battle appears to have raged for centuries, leaving orbital debris fields that still pose hazards to navigators. In the aftermath, the system was reduced to unusable wreckage, the gas giant destabilized, several moons shattered, and planetary crusts stripped bare. For the Administratum, this engagement represents a cautionary tale, often cited in political debates concerning the futility of engaging war-obsessed xenos species with total war doctrines. The Krorks did not merely defeat the Necrons in Draxia, they annihilated the entire theatre to such an extent that no victor could meaningfully exploit it. Smaller yet equally illustrative examples exist. On Kulta's tomb, a planet located near the galactic rim, records indicate a Krork incursion fought not against Necrons, but against remnants of Old One forces themselves. This anomaly highlights the unpredictable nature of Krork allegiance once unleashed. The battle appears to have been sparked by resource competition, or possibly by the Krorks' instinctual drive to fight anything within reach. Archaeological remains show titanic melee weapon strikes upon Old One citadels, their crystal structures shattered as if by blunt instruments of unimaginable size. Here, the aftermath was marked not only by physical ruin, but by the collapse of a once thriving ecosystem. Mechanicus reports describe fossilized remains of megafauna, displaying trauma consistent with shockwaves and concussive force rather than radiation or heat. The implication is that Krork combat could destabilize entire biospheres without deliberate effort. Administratum observers categorize Kulta's tomb as a negative-sum battlefield, meaning both sides lost any possibility of long-term survival. The most chilling records of Krork warfare are not the grand campaigns, however, but the localized battles that reveal their tendencies when external enemies were absent. One such record is the fall of the Maya colonies, a cluster of swamp planets once utilized by the Old Ones for biological experimentation. After the Necrons withdrew, Krork forces stationed in the region turned on one another. Evidence of mass graves, weapons caches turned inward, and dueling fortresses suggest a civil war of staggering proportions. Administratum archivists note that these findings highlight the inherent instability of the Krorks. When deprived of enemies, their violence sought outlets within their own kind. The aftermath was identical to their external campaigns, total devastation, but the difference lay in purpose. In this case, destruction was not strategic but inevitable. For the Mechanicus, this example supports the theory that Krork biology was fundamentally unsustainable, ensuring their eventual degeneration into Orks. From a political perspective, both the Administratum and the Mechanicus treat these records with unease. The Administratum focuses on the economic cost reports, often noting that Krork battlefields rendered entire sectors permanently uninhabitable. They categorize such theatres as lost investments, worlds stripped of both natural resources and potential for future colonization. In bureaucratic terms, Krork campaigns created voids in the ledger of galactic civilization, areas that would forever remain barren entries. The Mechanicus, on the other hand, emphasizes technological observations. They seek patterns in the war debris, consistent use of seismic weaponry, standardized plating materials across multiple war machines, and recurrent signs of psychic reinforcement woven into mechanical systems. These details suggest a level of technological continuity absent in modern Orks. Yet every battlefield also underscores the Krorks' eventual flaw. Their machines were so dependent on psychic resonance that once the Gestalt field collapsed, they became inert husks. Thus, while Mechanicus adepts regard the Krorks as an apex of biological engineering design, they also view them as a failed experiment in technological sustainability. The gain and loss analysis produced by these institutions converges on a singular conclusion. Every Krork battle, regardless of outcome, produced long-term losses for galactic stability. When the Krorks won, they destroyed so thoroughly that no infrastructure remained to exploit. When they lost, the devastation they caused during resistance made recovery equally impossible. The Administratum therefore regards them as a net liability to the history of civilization, a species whose presence could never yield economic or territorial gain. The Mechanicus, while more fascinated by their technical accomplishments, admits that the Krorks represented a dead end. Machines that could only function in the presence of their creator's psychic biology, a society without the capacity for permanence, and a legacy that collapsed into savagery. The final analysis preserved in the archives reflects a rare convergence of two great imperial institutions. Both the Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus recognize the Krorks as an unavoidable reminder of the dangers of designing war without limitation. In the cold language of the Administratum, they are recorded as a permanent deficit species. In the reverent but equally cautious records of the Mechanicus, they are treated as a sublime yet unstable design. The battlefield aftermaths serve as case studies. Planets destabilized beyond use, star systems rendered barren, and ecosystems extinguished in a matter of centuries. For the Imperium, these serve as warnings, though often ignored. When war itself is made the sole purpose of a species, the aftermath is always ruin. Among the various agencies of the Imperium, few regard the possibility of surviving Krork enclaves with the same mix of suspicion and urgency as the Inquisition. For them, the question is not merely one of antiquarian curiosity or xenos taxonomy. Instead, it is a question of existential threat, hidden continuity, and the limits of the Orkoid legacy. The Orks that populate the galaxy in the present age are brutal, chaotic, and widespread, yet their crude mannerisms and sporadic organization are seen as a pale shadow of what their progenitors may once have represented. If the Orks of today are a constant problem for imperial worlds, the Krorks of antiquity are viewed as a potential apocalypse waiting in dormancy. Inquisitorial documentation, primarily maintained in the Order Xenos but with contributions from the Order Malleus and Order Hereticus, emphasizes that the Krorks were created by the Old Ones as a deliberate weapon against the Necrontyr and their Catan patrons. This fact alone positions them differently in the eyes of the Inquisition compared to naturally evolved xenos races. They are not merely another species struggling for survival or empire building in the void, but rather a manufactured war engine designed to contest some of the most destructive powers the galaxy has ever known. In this light, their potential rediscovery or resurgence is perceived not as an academic matter, but as a strategic fault line, one capable of destabilizing every established power. Records reveal that inquisitorial debate over the Krorks is divided into two broad schools. One side argues that the Orks, being genetically degenerated descendants, have irreversibly lost the coherence and direction of their ancestors. To them, the danger is overstated. Any fragment of Krork power encountered today would be incomplete, isolated, and incapable of replicating the Old One's original grand design. The other side, however, insists that the durability of Orkoid biology and the persistence of their embedded technological instincts make it plausible that Krork genetic potential still lies dormant, waiting for the right conditions to manifest. This faction is particularly concerned about reports from the Adeptus Mechanicus of anomalous Ork constructs, or oversized war beasts that appear to exceed the crude norms of greenskin design. To such inquisitors, these phenomena may be nothing less than partial re-emergences of Krork heritage. Inquisition files also point to the political volatility of acknowledging Krork survivals. To openly declare the existence of a superior, proto-Ork species risks creating panic among Imperial command structures already stretched thin by the countless xenos, heretic, and demonic foes. Thus, much of the information is suppressed, relegated to sealed archives accessible only to the highest-ranking inquisitors. Even when reports of unusually advanced Ork warbands surface, the language used in official transmission avoids overtly linking them to the Krorks. Instead, phrases such as primeval strain, anomalous caste, or archaic phenotype are employed to maintain plausible deniability. There is also the matter of theological unease. The ecclesiarchy does not concern itself with xenos taxonomy, but the very notion that the Orks, so widely regarded as crude, brutish and laughable in their barbarism, might be degraded remnants of a far greater weapon, challenges certain narratives of human superiority. To mitigate this, Inquisitors often emphasize the degeneracy of the current Ork species rather than the power of their forebears, portraying the Krorks as a warning rather than as an achievement. This rhetorical strategy frames the Krorks not as paragons, but as evidence of what happens when mankind is not vigilant against the hubris of alien design. The Ordo Xenos also evaluates the hypothetical resurgence of Krork formations in tactical terms. A Krork warband, unlike a typical Ork horde, would not simply charge in reckless waves. The records of their coordinated technology, towering war machines, and hierarchical command structures suggest that even a modestly sized Krork host could replicate the destructive scale of a modern Imperial Crusade force. The possibility of a xenos species capable of combining the Orks' genetic adaptability with true strategic focus is considered intolerable. From this perspective, Inquisitors argue for immediate extermination protocols at even the faintest sign of Krork activity, regardless of collateral loss. The Ordo Xenos also evaluates the hypothetical resurgence of Krork formations in tactical terms. A Krork warband, unlike a typical Ork horde, would not simply charge in reckless waves. The records of their coordinated technology, towering war machines, and hierarchical command structures suggest that even a modestly sized Krork host could replicate the destructive scale of a modern Imperial Crusade force. The possibility of a xenos species capable of combining the Orks' genetic adaptability with true strategic focus is considered intolerable. From this perspective, Inquisitors argue for immediate extermination protocols at even the faintest sign of Krork activity, regardless of collateral loss. In conclusion, the Inquisition's impressions of the Krorks oscillate between dread and denial, between suppression and forbidden curiosity. They are a shadow on the Orks, a spectre of what once was, and a potential warning of what could return. To the Inquisition, the Krorks are less a species of the past than a latent crisis waiting to destabilize the fragile balance of the present. The surviving record of Krork activity in the current era of the Imperium is fragmentary, contested, and often deliberately obscured. While mainstream administratum accounts treat the Krorks as entirely extinct, scattered evidence preserved in inquisitorial vaults and Mechanicus sealed archives paints a more complicated picture. Across millennia, certain encounters with Ork forces have exhibited anomalies inconsistent with their usual behaviours. These irregularities, whether in battle conduct, technological application or physical scale, have fueled speculation that traces of the Krork legacy persist. The most persistent category of anomaly is battlefield coordination. Orks are typically defined by reckless aggression, unpredictable strategy, and a reliance on overwhelming numbers. Yet in a handful of engagements, Imperial commanders have reported Ork hosts demonstrating a level of structured discipline alien to their usual disorder. These anomalies include formations holding rank under sustained fire, withdrawal and regrouping maneuvers, and even the establishment of flanking ambushes with precision timing. Such reports are often dismissed as exaggeration by officers unwilling to concede strategic defeats, but in sealed inquisitorial summaries, these incidents are flagged as potential manifestations of Krork inheritance. The idea that Ork warbands might, under certain circumstances, unlock dormant genetic memory of Krork discipline is regarded with grave concern. A related anomaly concerns the scale of individual Orkoid physiology. Isolated reports describe greenskin war leaders of immense size, towering far above even the largest recorded war bosses. Accounts from the Second Arakan Compliance War detail a creature that dwarfed an Imperial knight, wielding a crude but devastating energy weapon, resembling descriptions of Krork armaments. The engagement was never formally logged in administratum annals, but an inquisitorial after-action file, designated KX sealed/144.993M41 notes that it took the combined firepower of 3 Baneblades and sustained orbital strikes to bring the creature down. The report concludes with a heavily redacted warning that its genetic material exhibited anomalous coding suggestive of pre-Ork design. The sample was transferred to Mars, and no further information has been released. Documented encounters also extend to the behaviour of Ork constructs. While Ork technology is normally characterised by haphazard design, erratic maintenance, and reliance on psychic gestalt, there are scattered records of machines that function with an uncanny precision. In one such case, the Battle of Zoros Gap, year 607 to 1 millennia 40, Imperial forces encountered an Ork war engine resembling a Gargant, but exhibiting structural reinforcement and weapons arrays far more advanced than expected. Notably, the machine coordinated its fire in synchrony with surrounding infantry, targeting supply lines and armoured transports, rather than the more typical Ork practice of indiscriminate frontal assault. The Zoros campaign was lost, and Imperial withdrawal was justified in official histories as a logistical setback. The sealed Inquisition record, however, identifies the war engine as a possible surviving relic of Krork design, and notes that its destruction required the intervention of a full Titan maniple. Other anomalies are less technological and more cultural. Reports exist of Ork groups engaging in pre-battle rituals markedly different from their usual raucous displays. In one incident during the Gornal Rift skirmishes, year 882 millennia 39, Imperial observers recorded a warband entering battle only after enacting a solemn, synchronized rite involving the raising of massive banners marked with glyphs not present in any standard Ork lexicon. These glyphs bore striking resemblance to archaeotech patterns documented in Old One ruins, and fragments were confiscated by an inquisitorial kill team. What became of those relics remains unknown. In sealed reports, the possibility of Krork reversions is entertained with extreme caution. The hypothesis holds that certain environmental triggers, massive prolonged conflict, concentration of psychic resonance, or exposure to lost Old One technologies may unlock suppressed aspects of Orkoid genetic programming. If true, this would explain why such anomalies appear sporadically rather than consistently. The presence of war bosses who seem to awaken into something larger, stronger, and more disciplined than their peers may represent not chance mutation, but partial reactivation of Krork design. The Inquisition is not unanimous in interpreting these anomalies. Radical factions argue that what is observed are not true survivals of Krorks, but the natural evolutionary variability of Orkoid biology. Puritans, however, take the opposite stance. Even a fragmentary resurgence of Krork traits could be catastrophic, for it would mean that the galaxy is not merely plagued by Orks, but haunted by the potential return of the far deadlier species from which they descend. Consequently, most sealed reports recommend complete eradication of any force demonstrating such anomalies, with immediate suppression of all records. This explains why so many anomalies appear in scattered testimonies, but not in consolidated Imperial annals. The deepest vaults of the Ordo Xenos contain files that are never intended for the scrutiny of the wider Imperium. Among these are fragments, observations, and restricted reports that speak to the enduring spectre of the Krorks. While the Administratum closes its books with the confident assertion of extinction, and the Mechanicus speaks only in hushed conjecture about genetic relics, the Inquisition bears the burden of classification. Within these records lies a spectrum of suppressed data, battlefield anomalies, relic seizures, and autopsies of creatures that by all rights should not exist in this age. One sealed report designated KX sealed/2 21.009M40 originates from a minor frontier war in the Lornax Expanse. An Imperial Guard regiment stationed there encountered Orkoid resistance that seemed initially typical. Yet, in the third week of the campaign, a single colossal figure emerged, rallying disparate mobs into a unified assault formation. The creature was described as over 12 meters tall, clad in armor that appeared to be scavenged yet bore unfamiliar symmetries of design. Imperial Vox recordings captured its commands, which the Orks obeyed with unusual discipline. The campaign collapsed within days, and a kill team was dispatched to confirm the destruction of the entity. The sealed conclusion: Subject demonstrated characteristics consistent with Krork genetic activation. Complete denial of incident is required. Survivors reassigned or silenced. Another classified file details the discovery of a derelict war engine on the fringes of the Segmentum Tempestus. Recovered by a Mechanicus exploratory fleet, the construct was initially believed to be a gargant of a typical design. Closer examination revealed machine spirits absent, redundant stabilizers integrated with unusual precision, and weaponry operating beyond expected Orkoid psychic reinforcement. The Inquisition intervened, ordering the vessel and its contents incinerated via orbital lance strikes. In the final analysis appended to the file, a Magos redactor wrote, "Patterns suggest remnants of Krork machine forging. Dangerous to retain, safer to destroy, safer still to forget." The third and perhaps most troubling document comes from the Ordo Xenos archive KX Suprema /888.401.millennia41, redacted in almost its entirety. What fragments remain reference the apparent excavation of a pre-imperial vault world believed to be seeded by the Old Ones. The operation was led under secrecy, and among its catalogued findings were large skeletal remains unlike those of Orks. Measurements indicate heights exceeding standard war bosses, with cranial structures suggesting enhanced neural capacity. The brief surviving notation reads, "These were not Orks, these were their progenitors. Memory of this site is to be suppressed. Access locked to inquisitorial level only." The final addendum orders exterminators of the system, ensuring the truth could never spread. Taken together, these files form a mosaic of fear and denial. The Inquisition's final thoughts on the Krorks, drawn from multiple sealed conclaves, can be summarized in a single doctrinal position. The Krorks must not return. Whether they truly are extinct, partially dormant in the genetic substrata of Orkoid biology, or haunting the galaxy through the relics of a forgotten age, the conclusion is the same. Their resurgence would represent a disaster on a scale the Imperium is not prepared to face. Even Orks, troublesome as they are a tolerable chaos compared to the notion of disciplined, towering war beasts once unleashed by the Old Ones. Thus, the Inquisition's policy is one of obliteration and silence. Every anomaly is to be erased, every witness silenced, every relic destroyed or locked beyond reach. Official histories must present a unified picture. The Krorks are gone, their legacy reduced to myth, their shadow swallowed by the green tide of the lesser Orks. The Inquisition accepts the paradox of its position, that to protect the Imperium, it must lie to the Imperium. The final assessment, though redacted in countless variations, appears across several sealed reports in identical phrasing. If the Krorks endure, they must never be known. If they return, the galaxy must not survive them.